Are we ready to get started? Okay. For those of you that have joined us, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. My name is Cinnamon Moffett. I'm the Research Program Manager at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center in Newport, Oregon, and I will be your host for this event. As you can see, we have several panelists, and before I introduce them and we get started with our presentation today, I have a few logistics. I wanted to let you know that due to the fact that we're using a webinar for this event, your mics and cameras and screen shares have been disabled, but we would love to have you communicate with us using the chat. So you can find that at the bottom of your webinar screen. You are able to open up the chat box and type in any questions throughout, and then we'll answer those when we get to the end of the presentation. I also wanted to let folks know that we will be, and we are recording this particular event. And if you need to go back and view it again, at the beginning of the chat box, I did put in the place where I post the recordings for our Thursday seminars. So you're welcome to get into that or share it with others that aren't able to join us today. I wanted to give a couple of announcements as well. As I see the numbers continuing to grow of our participants today, I know there's a few folks that maybe aren't familiar with our Hatfield Thursday seminars, but these events happen every week. And if you are interested in learning more about them, you can go to the HMSC website, scroll to the bottom, and there is a panel there that talks about future events. And with that in mind, just want to promote our next Science on Tap, which is an evening event, will happen on June 25th. Angie Dewar will be talking to us about the local fishing fleet here in Newport. And also want to promote next week's seminar. We have Craig Norrie from Oregon State University, who's going to be talking about larval overspill from aquaculture, assisting bivalve restoration efforts. And so excited to learn a little bit more about that. But with all of that, what we really want to do is learn about why we're here today. And so let me introduce today's panelists. We have Caren Braby, who's the Marine Resource Program Manager with Oregon's Department of Fish and Wildlife here in Newport. Hi, Caren. There she is. We have Kelly Corbett, who is the Commercial Crab Project Leader at Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife in Newport, Oregon. She's not on camera, but she's here and she can see all of us. We have Amanda Gladics, who is the Coastal Fisheries Extension Faculty with Oregon Sea Grant at Oregon State University based in Astoria, Oregon. Hi, Amanda. And we have Leigh Torres, who is Assistant Professor, Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, and Director of the Geospatial Ecology Marine Megafauna Lab, otherwise known as the GEM Lab, with the Marine Mammal Institute at Hatfield in Newport, Oregon. And so with that, I believe Caren's going to start us off, and then we're going to bounce back and forth a little bit with our presenters. So be a little patient as we switch screens, but I am going to jump off and hand it off to Caren.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, you sound good.
Fantastic. So thank you, Amanda, and thanks to everybody for joining us. I get to kick off this discussion, and I am doing it on behalf of my co-presenters, a host of collaborators, Kelly being one of them, but Troy Buell, Brittany Harrington, and Craig Hayslip as well. And partners in institutions from OSU Hatfield, ODFW, Sea Grant, the Coast Guard, the Oregon Dungeness Crab Commission, and NOAA Fisheries. Oregon Dungeness Crab Commission and NOAA Fisheries in particular have contributed funding in real dollars, whereas the rest of us have been contributing in-kind support for this work. And I also want to acknowledge that this work is due to conversations that have been happening for some time on the West Coast and in Oregon, particularly with the Oregon Whale Entanglement Working Group, which I'll mention later in the talk. So my role here is to really give us a statement of the problem. I'll start with a description of the crab fishery and the increasing incidents of whale entanglements. I'll hand it off to Leigh to talk about the Oregon Whale Distribution Study, who will then hand it off to Amanda to talk about a complementary citizen science collaboration project that's part of the Whale Distribution Study. And then I'll wrap up with talking about how this research and monitoring is feeding into management measures and actions by the agency and by the crab fleet itself. So starting with the crab fishery, it is the most valuable single species commercial fishery in Oregon. It's part of our culture, it's part of our economy. It is something that really is responsible for making coastal economies flow on the fishing side. And it's something that we have been harvesting and enjoying for decades and decades. It's a state managed fishery. There are 3 primary management measures that include size, sex, and season. So there's a size limit for each individual caught. We only retain males, and the season is set for the different crab fisheries that exist. And we have both sport and 2 different commercial fisheries. The commercial ocean fishery is limited, which means that there is a limited number of participants, a limited number of permits for operating a Dungeness crab vessel and business in terms of harvesting. And each permit has a specific pot limit to it. So there's a built-in cap of both participants and the number of pots that are possible to be fished in this fishery. And while that I'm describing the Oregon system, that is also true for the fisheries in Washington and California. The 3 states, Oregon, Washington, and California, have a tri-state agreement which leads to better coordination on key issues across the West Coast on the Dungeness crab fishery. And that body or that agreement, that process definitely contributes to our management significantly. And then another way that the state managed fishery for Dungeness crab is managed is through compliance with federal laws. And here I've just given 2 examples, but the ones that are of importance today, the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act. Something else I want to describe about the fishery is that there is a specific season, as I mentioned. It runs from December 1st through the middle of August. And over the later months, you can see that on this graph, which runs from December through August, can you see my cursor? Yes, from December through August, there is an attrition of effort in terms of the number of pots that are used in the fishery. And this is true season after season. This is showing 5 different seasons of the fishery. And what we also know in terms of our best information on whale distribution in our waters is that for humpback whales, April through August is a period of time where we see elevated numbers of whales in our waters. So this will be important as we kind of build up the case for the design of the research project and the monitoring project that Leigh will describe. So the problem comes in that in the last 5 or 6 years, there has been an increase in entanglements of whales, a few entanglements of sea turtles as well on the West Coast. And it's really been starting in 2014 and leading up to present time. Here I'm just showing the crab gear entanglements, but there are other fisheries involved, and yet crab gear is the most identified or the most commonly identified of the identified gear. The increase that we see in the last 5 years is driven largely by humpback whales in dark blue on these bars. And the good news is that the quality of data on the quality of data that is reported and the actual frequency of reporting seems to be improving, probably through increased public awareness of this issue, establishment of things like a hotline to make reports. And so that's contributing to this pattern, but it's definitely not all of it. In fact, it may be only a small fraction. And so one of the things that we're really interested in is, outside of public awareness, what can we attribute these increased entanglements to? Looking just at Oregon, we have a fairly small number of entanglements on a fairly routine basis. It's 1 or 2 a year that are observed and reported. And you'll note that in the last 5 or 6 years, most of the entanglements have been of, most of the observed entanglements have been of humpback whales, whereas earlier than 2014, most of the entanglements were of gray whales. So there's been what we seem to think as a shift in the species that are being entangled in gear, and maybe, you know, some change in the abundance or the number of entanglements, but we have such a low rate, it is a rare event. And so it's hard to glean a lot of information from this graph in terms of incidence. But what it tells us is that this is a problem. It is Oregon gear, and it is affecting humpbacks, and all of the humpbacks that we enjoy off the coast of Oregon are ESA listed. And I'll get into that in a second. So in thinking about trying to manage this growing problem, or this new problem over the last 6 years, we're thinking about trying to really establish our understanding of whale density off the coast, trying to establish better information related to fishery effort, where and when that effort is occurring, and through this have some better understanding of co-occurrence. And currently, we do have information, but we're limited in a number of really key ways. One of which is that the established whale surveys do not cover the entire year. And so there's extrapolation methods and modeling efforts to try and identify whale distributions during those off months. And then fishery effort is documented, but we only know what that effort is in retrospect. So there's a lag time between when it's collected by the fishermen, delivered to the agency on logbook sheets, we get it entered into a database, and then can actually have some clear understanding of where the fishermen were fishing. And so this data limitation makes it difficult to know in real time what's happening with the fishery or what's happening with the whales and their co-occurrence. We also know that the distributions of both whales and fishing are very adaptive. The whales are following food, the fishermen are following crab, and those patterns change potentially from month to month, from year to year. And so having real-time information would be much more helpful in terms of management, potential management responses, if we could quantify those. So I wanted to go through a little bit of whale biology relative to our biggest species of concern, which is humpback whales, because they have increased in incidence in our entanglements over the last few years, and because of their protected status. So the map here shows you tropical, subtropical latitudes, all of the breeding populations of all of the population segments of humpback whales globally. These are distinct population segments. And for the North Pacific, where we live, we have 3 that you can see by these dotted lines. Sorry, I'm working on the wrong monitor. These dotted lines lead from the breeding populations 4, 5, and 6, which is Hawaii, Mexico, and Central America, lead up to these feeding grounds where we see them in the summer months. So I wanted to go to this next slide anyway. Okay, so in addition to protections under the Endangered Species Act, which defines humpback whales by their breeding populations, we do have these feeding grounds that serves as the definition under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So the humpback whales are protected by both, and yet this difference in definition of how these populations are defined causes confusion and can cause problems in really assessing which populations are threatened and how to address those challenges. So under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the California, Oregon, Washington stock is considered a unit. It is depleted. It is comprised of two subunits, the California, Oregon feeding group and the Washington, Southern British Columbia feeding group. So here showing a map of the West Coast feeding sites. We see that the California, Oregon feeding group is comprised of both the threatened Mexico breeding population, as well as the endangered Central American breeding population. And so from about the Columbia River south, you have a mixture of these two threatened or endangered distinct population segment species or genetic units. And then from the Columbia River north, you have not only those two units, but then the delisted healthy Hawaiian breeding population of humpback whales. So for Oregon, the concern is that, as I mentioned earlier, all of the whales, all the humpback whales that we see off our coast fall into one of those two categories by our best estimate, our best scientific information now. And so this really causes concern not only from a marine mammal protection perspective, but also from a population DPS perspective. So really, from thinking about why this is happening and why this increased occurrence has occurred over the past 6 years or so, we're really looking at a number of potential factors. I mentioned a couple already. A big one is changes in environmental conditions, and the fact that this increased incidence has coincided with the onset of the marine heat wave known as the blob, and a major shift in ocean conditions is definitely an issue of concern. That led to a number of changes, including shifting prey patterns, shifting fishing effort patterns, and coincidentally, we had an increased awareness of entanglement activities. Fortunately, either stable or increasing whale abundance as well. And so the smoking gun here right now is really kind of shifting spatio-temporal whale distribution patterns. And this is really where we kind of connect with the research project that Leigh is going to talk about to get not a West Coast scale map of whale distribution, but rather an Oregon specific, a very local picture of where whales are, when they arrive, when they leave. And by knowing this, we'll really kind of better understand co-occurrence patterns and be able to manage those and react to those. So I will now turn it over to Leigh, who will talk about where and when whales and crab gear overlap.
Do you see my slides and hear me? Yes, okay.
Yes.
Awesome. Good. Technology is on our side so far. Okay, wonderful. Caren, thank you for that great introduction. And yeah, so I'm going to take the baton at this point and talk about the research that's addressing this central issue about where and when are the whales in Oregon. And I just want to start by flagging that this question was really highlighted during our whale entanglement working group meetings, which brought together a bunch of different stakeholders, so fishermen, scientists, managers, conservation groups, and everybody agreed that this was a real knowledge gap, knowing where and when whales are, that was hurting our ability to manage and address this conservation issue. So, so the Oregon Dungeness Crab Commission really stepped up early on, recognized this problem and this need, and supported the project to begin with. And then since then, we've received funding from NOAA Fisheries. It's a huge collaborative effort. So I'm really grateful for that. So yeah, so the first question we had to deal with was, well, how are we going to do this? How are we going to collect data throughout all months of the year and across a large spatial scale? And, you know, if you spend any time in coastal Oregon, you see a orange helicopter flying around quite often. And this brought out the idea, well, maybe we could collaborate with the Coast Guard. And sure enough, they were very amenable to the idea and have been incredible supporters and collaborators. So as you can see here, Craig is in a helicopter surveying for whales off our coast. Oh, why isn't my slides advancing? Ruh-roh. Oh, okay. We're good? I hope so. Okay, so these two plots on the right show our track lines that we fly. So each plot shows the same track lines. One's just the plot on the left shows the track lines overlaid on bathymetry, and the one on the right shows the track lines overlaid on a density plot of Dungeness crabbing effort over a bunch of years between 2012 and 2016. So with our design, we did have a few limitations because we were working with the Coast Guard. One was that each of our track lines had to be less than 150 nautical miles in length. And we also had to leave and depart from the same port, so the same base. And so we're working with two different Coast Guard sectors. One is the Columbia River Coast Guard sector based in Warrenton up by Astoria. And so they help us fly that northern track line out of Astoria. And then we work with the North Bend sector down in North Bend. And with them, we fly those two routes out of North Bend, the North Bend South line and the North Bend North line, and also the Newport line. So our goal with this, with these methods is to mimic sawtooth transect lines. So you can see that they have this sawtooth pattern, and that is so that we overlap variable habitat during our surveys, near shore, offshore, deep, slope, and also we wanted to cover a variable crabbing effort areas. So areas where we know that there is typically high density crabbing effort as well as low density crabbing effort. And our goal is to conduct each of these 4 track lines once a month for 2 years. So when we fly with the Coast Guard, we fly at 90 knots at 500 feet. We only have one observer in the helicopter who is also the data recorder. So it's a lot for one person to do. Typically when you do aerial surveys, you have more than one in the aerial survey helicopter or plane, but you know, we do what we can because we have limited space, but it's been working really well so far. We employ distance sampling methods, which means that we monitor our sighting conditions so we can determine how far we're seeing, under what conditions. So when we have worse sighting conditions, we can see whales less far. So we monitor that throughout our entire survey period. And we're generally in passing mode, so which means when we see whales, we record it and we keep going along, but sometimes we break every now and then our transect line to go and identify whales. So we use this C-Scribe program developed by BOEM, and we basically use it to record where and when we see different species of whales, how many whales we're seeing, and our sighting conditions like visibility in Beaufort Sea State. We use a GPS as our backup location data. We have binoculars up there to help us spot and identify species. We also use this gizmo that I'm holding in my hand here called a geometer, and basically it helps us when we see a whale, we can use it to determine the exact declination, the exact angle to the whale, and based on that and the altitude of our helicopter, we can determine how far away the whale is from us based on triangulation. And then we have a camera that helps us with identification. So these are our two survey platforms. On the left is the Dolphin helicopter that we use out of North Bend, which is smaller than the Jayhawk, which is the helicopter that we use out of the Columbia River sector, which is on the right. And you can see in both cases, you see me there on the left and Craig on the right. We have a lot of equipment, binoculars, helmets, tablets, GPS, cameras, and we have limited space, but we have good observation window. We basically monitor from the nose of the helicopter just beyond 90 degrees on the side of the helicopter that we're on. So it has good observation capacity, and we've been recording lots of great data. Here, hopefully you can see this video. It just demonstrates Craig taking pictures of a, I think that's a fin whale down there, yep, with some dolphins swimming around the whale. So this is just to give you an idea of what it's like. Craig hanging out the window there, don't worry, he's strapped in. But yeah, so we have been getting lots of great data. So we've also been seeing gray whales. There's a fin whale, humpback whales, blue whales, killer whales, and then some dolphin species like northern right whales, dolphins, northern right whale dolphins, Rizzo's dolphins, and boats and crab pots as well. So, but we also, I want to point out, see a lot of blows that we can't identify, and that's pretty typical of whale surveys, and they go down as unidentified large whales. So one other component of the project that I do want to briefly mention is that our boat-based effort, which is when we see an aggregation of whales, when we spot it from the helicopter, our plan is to mobilize in a small research vessel and go out and conduct photo ID and biopsy effort. So biopsy effort using a crossbow like here what Craig is holding. And this is an example from someplace else, but you can see that they have fired, and here's the dart that just after hit the whale, and that allows us to get a small tissue sample from the whale that we can then do genetics on. And this work is in collaboration with the Cascadia Research Collective and the Cetacean Conservation and Genomics Lab in the Marine Mammal Institute, where we're trying to develop a better understanding of the population structure of whales off Oregon. And this will inform those distinct population segments that Caren was talking about, so to figure out which groups of whales are actually using our Oregon waters. So here's our data to date. We have conducted 49 helicopter surveys starting back in February of 2019. And as you can see, we were doing pretty well at conducting our 4 surveys a month goal. Most of the time, the gray boxes were when we weren't able to get up either due to weather, or sometimes the Coast Guard has issues with their helicopters and not available or so forth. But you'll see that our last survey was in March 2013, or this past March, and yeah, our surveys have been suspended since then due to COVID-19. So we're trying to work with the Coast Guard to find a safe way to get back up in the air soon. So hopefully we can continue, because our goal is to collect 2 full years of these monthly surveys. But for now, for the rest of this talk, I'll just show you a little bit of our data that was collected between this March to December period. And I just want to emphasize that these data are the raw data, so they're just all the sightings. They haven't been standardized by our effort. So our ability to detect whales can change based on sighting conditions. So we haven't accounted for that in the results that I'll show you now. So these are the distribution of the sightings, the spatial distribution. Again, on the left, the dots are over bathymetry, and on the right, they're over that crabbing effort density layer. So the size of the dot is the size of the group that we saw, and the color is relative to the species. So you can see a few trends, one of which is we haven't seen too many whales up in the Astoria, the northern region, except for some near the Astoria Canyon, which has been interesting. Most of our whale sightings have been further to the south, and including mostly offshore. So you can see that in those near shore areas, sort of the red band where there's a lot of crabbing effort, the number of whales we've seen in that high density fishing effort have actually been fairly low, except for gray whales. We have seen more gray whales in that area, but generally our humpbacks and blue whales have been spotted more frequently on the offshore legs of our transect lines. You can see there are some little groups of blue whales here and here. So that's our data to date spatially. And then this is our sightings by month. And you can see that there's certainly a trend that, again, this isn't standardized by effort, so it's a little bit hard to tell, but you can see that generally we did see more whales in the summer months and through to about November. And then this is the final data plot I'll show. But what it is, it has, again, month on the y-axis, and then depth, the depth at which we're seeing the different species on the, sorry, this is on the y-axis, month is on the x-axis. But so the gray whales are these green little boxes down at the bottom. And you can see that they're generally in the shallower waters, around 50 or less meters. But the humpback whales are generally in waters greater than 100 meters, including in these periods when we have more whales in the region. So these are the type of trends that we're trying to determine so that we can inform management. So what our end game here is to take these whale sightings and standardize them by our effort, and then create, we want to develop whale density models for humpback whales, blue whales, fin whales, and gray whales, which is where we compare where we saw and didn't see whales to many environmental layers. And we want to do that at a seasonal scale. And then once we've done that, we'll be able to create these predictions of their distribution, which are generally currently unknown at the spatial and temporal scale that we're concerned about. And once we've done that, then we'll compare those those seasonal prediction layers to fishing effort data that ODFW is gonna develop based on their logbook data. And then from that, we will develop these layers of entanglement risk, which are really what is needed to help ODFW and managers assess where fishing effort might need to be managed more in order to reduce risk to whales. So we also have a few other data sources of cetacean survey information that we're going to incorporate into this. A few surveys on the Oceanus and the Shimada, where we had marine mammal observers and in situ oceanography data collected. And then we also, we need sightings to validate our models. And so that, what I mean by that is from our helicopter surveys, we can't survey everywhere all the time. And so because of that, we have data gaps in our knowledge. And so when we develop these whale density predictions, what we want are validation points where people have actually seen whales. And we can use these validation points to test how good our predictions are. So we can figure out how good or bad our model predictions are, where we might be doing well in our predictions, such as these points here in the red. You know, those would be considered, yeah, we predicted those well, but these points out here in the blue where there's low predicted whale density would be considered bad. We'd had bad predictive confidence there. So this will help us make our predictions better and know where we can trust our predictions. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Amanda.
Thank you, Leigh. Okay, can you guys see my screen? Great. So Leigh's talked a lot about this massive effort that they're undertaking to collect standardized survey data of whale distributions. And like she said, they can't be everywhere all the time. And so we're taking the approach of recruiting citizen scientists to help expand our survey team to cover the times and places that U.S. Coast Guards are unable to cover. And we hope, that we can collect enough of these presence-only whale sightings to provide those validation points that the team needs to evaluate their models derived from the aerial surveys. So to do this, we are asking participants to report their whale sightings using a mobile app called Whale Alert. And this app was previously developed with funding from the NOAA Marine Sanctuary Program and International Fund for Animal Welfare to use in preventing ship strikes with whales, and now has been adapted to a variety of whale citizen science projects all around the world. So we are reaching out to a wide variety of interested stakeholders and ocean users And outreach to these different user groups plays a couple of different roles. First, it offers us an opportunity to provide information and education about this project and about the whale entanglement issues in general to this range of groups that have a vested interest in it. And it gives them a chance to contribute to this effort to help inform management around this issue. So I want to point out that citizen science really works the best and will be most useful as validation data for this project with a lot of data. So the more contributions of whale sightings, the better. And I can talk a little bit about some of our efforts to do specific outreach to these groups, but I can answer questions about that later. But I just want to point out that obviously the current situation with the COVID-19 pandemic has caused pretty significant disruptions for a lot of research, but also for coastal access to the locations where some of these groups would have the opportunity to see whales and therefore report their whale sightings. So I just want to make a specific request for everyone watching this presentation to consider joining our team of citizen scientists and report any whale sightings that you have the opportunity to make, either in the course of your daily life as a coastal community member on the Oregon coast, and obviously as we all get the opportunity to get back out on the water for research in the coming months. I hope you'll consider joining our team. So the Whale Alert app is available for both iPhone and Android operating systems. It's really easy to download and use. It's available in the app stores for both of those. When you open it up, you both get to see sightings that have already been made by other observers. And this is a recent screenshot from the app, and I'll tell you it's a lot more sightings on the Oregon coast than there were this time last year, which is great to see, but we definitely want to see a lot more on that map. So to make a sighting, you just click on the little binocular icon to initiate your sighting, and then follow the prompts to complete the information. And I should emphasize that we're really asking for sightings of whales that are swimming freely and behaving normally. Any whale in distress should be reported through the NOAA Whale Entanglement Hotline number, which is shown on the screen there. It's 877-SOS-WHALE. The app itself has some really useful identification resources built in for our most common species on the West Coast. And we also have some printed outreach materials that include information about the project and additional identification guides that I'd be happy to mail to anyone who's watching upon request. So here are a couple links and resources about where you can find more information about the citizen science aspect of the project, and the links to download the Whale Alert app. So now I will hand it back over to Caren to talk about some of ODFW's efforts.
Okay, let me pick the right screen. How does that look?
Looks good.
Okay, so we are past this point. And so now we're getting into kind of how we as a management agency have regulations that can do something with the information that Leigh and Amanda are helping collect. And as I've already mentioned briefly, we have a layered approach to managing the crab resource. First and foremost, we have state regulations that require, or that limits the participants, it limits the pots, it has requirements about the gear, how the gear are used, size, sex, and season, so on. Into that, we're talking have already taken actions to build in additional accountability measures and risk reduction measures related to the whale entanglement issue. Second layer of management is through this tri-state agreement and coordination with Washington, Oregon, and California. Through that agreement, we address issues including pre-season testing, biotoxin management in crab as the seafood product, And now talking about whale entanglement risk reduction and aligning the efforts of all 3 states so that it's better informed for the managers and more consistent and informed by industry from the water. The third layer of management in our framework is the federal laws that apply to this fishery. And although the federal laws do not dictate how the fishery is operated, it does dictate that we must be in compliance with federal laws that are relevant. I already mentioned the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act. And I will talk about the conservation plan legal mechanism, which is something that will help us bring compliance of this fishery relative to this whale entanglement issue. So we're developing our management in a number of different areas. I've already mentioned regulations. We're gladly collaborating with Leigh and Amanda and other researchers to better understand both the problems and whale biology and ecology. Working on our own awareness, but also awareness of others on these issues and potential solutions. And then there's this conservation plan, which really incorporates all of the above, builds in state regulations, research and monitoring, and also builds adaptive triggers for building in new information across the lifespan of the conservation plan, which has a variable time length depending on the applicant and how that's run. So our vision and kind of having this approach, this multi-pronged approach, is that we are going to continue to align and improve the alignment of management and conservation goals so that we can have both a viable crab fishery and conservation goals are addressed with ESA listed whale species in particular, but in general for marine life. So I'll talk about a couple of these goals in a little bit more detail, tell you what our progress is. For goal 1 in fishery accountability, this is different from risk reduction, but it is kind of building our ability to learn more from each entanglement and improve our understanding of real-time activity of the crab fleet on the water, those types of accountability measures. And this graph shows you one of our current issues, and that is that out of all of the entanglements on the West Coast, about half of them are not attributable to a particular fishing gear type. So with only half of the gear that's entangled on whales being attributable, it's really hard to know what to change in order to make a difference in the number of entanglements. To address that gap, we last year made some improvements adding to our existing measures on marking Dungeness crab gear, including markings for the sport crab, recreational crab effort. We implemented a buoy color and pattern registration for the commercial ocean crab fleet. That is now combined with an outstanding requirement to have buoy tags and to have markings on the buoys that identify the permit holder that is connected to that gear. Just to make sure that everyone listening understands, crab pots are fished by one at a time, dropping them over the side of the boat. And so you can have a piece of gear, one single piece of gear that is independent of a vessel or some kind of fishing operation for a period of time. And so those gear marking efforts really identify this kind of independent unit of fixed gear out in the ocean. Another accountability measure is double-sided printing of buoy tags, which sounds like kind of a funny thing, but every single tiny piece of information that we can learn from each entanglement is critical. And there have been entanglements that have been observed where a buoy tag that has the printed name of the vessel and the year that that buoy tag was deployed or was legal in the ocean, it's printed on that buoy tag. And there have been many times where that buoy tag has been flipped over so you couldn't read the information on the tag. So a simple measure we took was to double side print those buoy tags. So regardless of the orientation of that tag, we can identify it if it's observed as part of an entanglement event. Another area that's kind of for the future is building up our ability to, as I said, really identify the crab effort in more real time than we currently do. And one step to do that was making a requirement for electronic fish tickets that now have a requirement for identifying one of 12 crab harvest areas off the coast of Oregon. And so in real time, we know which vessels are making landings and have been fishing in particular areas off of Oregon. This helps us understand kind of the spatial patterns of who's where, how many vessels are where, and this could lead to management measures in the future where we take measures to separate or minimize that overlap of crab and whales. The second goal is reducing risk of whale entanglements. And I already described, and you've heard Leigh describe as well, that it's the co-occurrence of the fishing activity and the whales that is our best way of trying to address this risk issue. There are probably other factors that will help us in the future, but this is our first attempt right now of really trying to better identify co-occurrence as a primary way that we see this increased incidence of entanglements. So the graph on the left shows the observation months when Oregon gear was identified in an entanglement. So this is summed over many years, but shows you for all of those events, which month of the year it was observed. And this is Oregon gear, but could have been observed as far away as Mexico, could have been observed in California or Washington. And so this kind of information helps us think about when in the season those entanglements are occurring. But Leigh's information will much improve our ability to really get down into the whale biology and ecology specifically, rather than just kind of by proxy thinking about co-occurrence occurring by entanglement observations. On the right, you have the footprint of the fishing effort, again, over a number of seasons, but binned into the first third, the second third, and the third third of the December to August crab season. And you can see that the pattern of the fishery contracts throughout the season, gets closer to shore, much less spread out as you move into the season. And so this gives us some ideas about how we can allow fishing activity to occur in months where whales are abundant off our coast. If we use bathymetry or depth of the crab fishery to kind of keep the crab pot effort in one area, whales in another area. All right, so on this front, we have a package, and here's yet another COVID reference. We have a package of recommendations that may be part of our state regulations. It's pending right now, and it includes a number of measures. So it's pending because this package of regulations was intended to be considered by our rulemaking body, our commission, in April of this year. and that meeting was canceled due to social distancing concerns. It has not been rescheduled. It will be rescheduled at some point later this summer or early fall. And in that package, we'll have a number of measures that will reduce risk in whale entanglements. Of primary interest is reduction in pot limit, so reducing the number of pots that are in the water. Secondly, that this reduction would occur in May when we have a higher abundance of whales in our waters. And then third, the pots will only be allowed within 30 fathoms of depth, which is that nearshore band, which is nearly coincident with the recent definition of humpback critical habitat off of Oregon. So both of these second measures, the date of reduction in gear and then the bathymetric restriction in where that gear can be fished, are directly related to the research project that Leigh described, and will be informed as she learns more in the future. It goes through the formal analysis of those data and builds predictive models. So this is our timeline that we're on. We've made mention of the Oregon Whale Entanglement Working Group that was comprised of many partners and really kind of kicked off the process in Oregon. Both Leigh and Amanda were, and Kelly from ODFW were part of that original working group, as well as our one of our funders, the Oregon Dungeness Crab Commission. And since then, ODFW has built accountability measures in our regulations in the state, and we're pending risk reduction regulations in the state. And all of that work, recommendations from the working group, as well as accountability and risk reduction measures, will be packaged together into our draft conservation plan, which will be submitted to NOAA, which is the regulatory agency over marine mammals. Our timeline for that is winter of this coming season, so sometime in early 2021. And in addition to the state regulations that we're putting in place, it will build in adaptive measures so that as we learn more, we can change our approach, all with the goal of reducing risk of whale entanglement over time. Final determination on the incidental take permit, which is the permission from NOAA to continue fishing, and with approval that we're doing our best to minimize impacts on ESA listed whales, will come at some point to be determined. The CP and ITP process is a long one. We're somewhere in the first or second year of that process, and it takes something like 3 to 5 years in total. So it could be as late as 2025 that we have a determination. It could be as early as maybe 2022. All along here, we will be implementing our regulatory measures. We'll be monitoring the fishery and working with researchers to monitor whales and adapting our approaches as we go. So I want to say thank you to my co-presenters, but I also want to take this chance to just acknowledge that one of our co-presenters has recently passed tenure, and I'm very thrilled that Leigh has passed that mark, and so just wanted to acknowledge that. So thanks, and happy to take questions.
Nice job, everybody, and congratulations, Leigh.
Thank you.
Huge.
Thank you, Caren.
So we are getting a couple of questions in the chat box. Kelly and Amanda have done a good job trying to keep up with them, but let me catch Leigh and Caren up a little bit. There was some questions about enforcement of regulations around the goal 1 that you presented, and the limited number of enforcement officers trying to do that task. Caren, can you speak a little bit to the ways that the enforcement is tackled in Oregon?
On fishery accountability, true?
True.
Yeah. Yeah, so fishery accountability measures on gear marking is, it's an ongoing process, but our fleet has become more and more aware of these issues. And we have a very specific point in time when we can evaluate compliance with things like gear marking, and that is at the season start. And every vessel that goes out is evaluated by OSP, gear is evaluated. And so there's kind of a time, place and time for that evaluation to occur. But enforcement is always an issue. And so there are bad apples, just like in any community of people. And we're probably more aware of that right now than we have been in recent years. So Oregon State Police as our enforcement partner and ODFW as the regulation holder spend a lot of time talking about why these regulations are so important and building kind of that community acknowledgement that these are important and in place for a reason. And our crab fleet has come a huge long way in terms of understanding the critical nature of whale entanglements and what it means for their future, for the fishery. And so they know that this is part of that problem and part of the solution for managing this problem in the future. So that's a broad answer to that question.
Thank you, Caren. This might be for Leigh. We have a question about understanding that your data is preliminary. It looks like there's not a huge overlap between the whales of concern and the fishing effort. So how positive are we that these entanglements are really a significant threat to the population?
Well, so entanglements are rare events. I mean, we know that almost everywhere that they happen. But when they do happen, they have significant impact on the population, and in particular populations that are already threatened and endangered. So even if, like Caren showed, only 1 or 2 are happening a year, but if that bumps up to 3 or 4, that is going to even have a bigger impact. So co-occurrence does occur. So the data I showed is very rough. I don't really think it's quite, it shouldn't be used quite for management yet. It gives an impression of where things are, but, and where we're going, but we still need to analyze it a lot more closely, I should say. So our goal is to inform management so that we can separate in time and space more so that the chances of co-occurrence are that much more reduced. Right now, I think there is a much higher chance of co-occurrence, and that's what's leading to at least a portion of the entanglements that we get. So if we can get rid of that portion of those rare events, our chances of sustaining healthy populations is that much greater.
Nice. Caren, this one's for you. Do we know whether these entanglements are related to derelict gear? And can you talk about the effort to pull derelict pots once they've been abandoned at the end of summer?
Yeah, that's a great question. So most of the entanglements have been attributed to active gear. And so even though it seems like derelict gear must be like a huge problem, and it is a problem, and we are addressing it, and I'll talk about that, we think that it's really the active gear that's more involved, and that's because there's more of it. And so this co-occurrence is really relevant. If there's more active gear out there, there's nothing inherently magical about it being active gear or derelict gear. There's just more active gear out there. And so the probability is that it's going to be interacting with whales. So we have a number of ways that we address derelict gear. We have provisions for captains to retrieve derelict gear in season. as well as a specific program to clean up gear after the season is over. And so both of these programs we have lots of participants in the fleet who bring in gear, and that's something that we will continue to do. There are improvements that we can make in that program, in that effort, and we make those plugs every year on how important getting gear out of the water is. And so that will be part of our ongoing effort moving forward.
We'll get a couple more questions here. We might not get to them all, everyone, but we'll do our best. There's a question here about interest in pop-up or ropeless gear and whether there's been testing around Oregon for that.
Leigh, do you want to take that?
I know that there has been some collaboration between Fran.
Correct.
Yes, thank you. Correct. I was blanking on her last name. She might even be online. I don't know. And Fisherman, she got some funding from to support some gear development and testing, and they have been testing that gear, different configuration. I'm not sure it's ropeless that they were testing. It was some other configurations. I'm not incredibly familiar with it, but yes. So ropeless gear is an interesting one. It would be amazing. There are drawbacks to ropeless gear. One is a management drawback that you can't really monitor where gear is set. So that is one problem with it. And nor can fishermen know where they're setting the gear if they're already setting it on top of other people's gear or so forth. So, and it's also expensive at this point, but they are making progress on it, I can tell you that much, especially on the East Coast dealing with the North Atlantic right whale entanglement issues. And they are doing testing, I believe, of some gear in California as well.
Yeah, I would just add to that, I would characterize the sense amongst at least the working group participants, and I think probably that's reflective of some of the broader sentiments around it, of watching the development closely, but not being quite ready to think about implementing it here. But definitely tracking the testing that's going on in California and in communication with the fishermen that are involved in that. Yeah.
Nice. There's a question about, this is Caren, for you. You talked about establishing a depth limit. Has there been action to engage stakeholders to determine what that kind of regulation might do to catch success?
Yeah, so all of our regulations are developed with a lot of public process and discussion with the crab fleet. And so that regulation recommendation, since it hasn't been adopted yet, is one that actually came from the fishermen, both through the whale entanglement working group as a potential solution, as well as through public meetings that we have with the crab fleet on a regular basis, including the fall of 2019. And so from that, and then with some additional analysis and Leigh's preliminary results and our kind of standing best scientific information on depth utilization by humpbacks, that led to our kind of comfort and at least initially establishing a bathymetric line as a recommendation to our commission. So I'm trying to share that was a progressive decision over many years, in fact, of discussion with the fleet, and the fleet is involved in all of the regulations that we have. And I don't want to convey that the fleet is unanimous on any single regulation, because there's a lot of diversity of opinions in the crab fleet, just like academia and just like in management. And so it's been a very rich discussion, but I think we've arrived at some solutions that have a lot of potential for really addressing some of these issues.
So I want to be really respectful of our panelists' time. I'm going to ask one more question, but there is about 12 more questions on the chat box. So I'm just going to say, if you have a question that we are not able to answer, please reach out to our panelists directly. They'd be happy to answer your questions and engage you on any of these particular topics. But the question I wanted to ask was, we have some folks on from Washington that are interested to know whether similar studies are happening up in Puget Sound with the helicopter and the Coast Guard, and if you could speak about basically this being a seed that might spread, that would be great.
Yeah, I'll take that one on behalf of us all. So yes, that is something we've been talking about, and it's great to hear that somebody from the U.S. Coast Guard sector in the Puget Sound is interested in collaborating on this. We are hoping to expand our methodology now that we've sort of established it and proved that it can work, and collect some really good data and valuable data and be a healthy collaboration. We are thinking about extending the temporal range of our study to basically continue it onward, and also the spatial range by working with helicopter Coast Guard sectors up in Washington. So because this issue certainly extends up into Washington waters as well, and as Caren pointed out, the whales are all one stock, and they sort of use all the waters up and down the West Coast. So really it's a West Coast wide issue, and the more information we get at a larger spatial scale, I think the better off we'll be. So yeah, that's great. If whoever wrote that, emailed me or Caren or Amanda or all three of us your details, we could certainly talk and extend this conversation.
Great. I just want to thank you all for being a part of this, and for everybody online, thank you so much for your interest, for your comments, for your engagement. We are excited to see this project move forward, to look at the data and maybe see it grow and continue. It's definitely a valuable effort. So thank you all very, very much. And for those of you that are online still, feel free to join us next week. Same place, different link, but you can find that information on the HMSC website. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you. Leigh, I'll see if I can pull the chat and I'll send you.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the other questions here.
Yeah, there's some in-depth ones.
Okay. Yeah, it'd be interesting to read them through.
We don't have contact info for the attendees, do we?
We do not. It's not a registration required event. So we're really going to depend on them reaching out to you specifically if they have questions, if you don't recognize their names.
Okay.
How did it go with the handoff and everything?
I think it went well. It looked pretty seamless. Just for those of you that are still on, you had 113 participants.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
So I feel really, really happy that's a good solid number. And our average for these events are about 30, 40, 45. So that was double.
Wow, cool. Yeah, well, it's a
topic.
Yeah, well, and I recognize a few participants from the California working group and a few other folks. So we definitely got some regional interest in this one, which is really nice to see that they're tracking.
Yeah.
I got contacted from the East Coast, people I didn't recognize. You might have recognized them, just confirming the link and those kind of things. So it definitely got out there and people were interested.
Oh, wow, that's cool.
Great.
Yeah. I hope that guy from Washington reaches out. No.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Didn't recognize his name.
Yeah.
Or their name. And then, yeah, when we're ready to do another follow-up and maybe an evening event, something like that, let me know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we need to get back up in the air and start analyzing the postdoc who's supposed to help with all the distribution modeling. We can't quite get her in country yet, so it's visa issues and COVID issues. So anyway, yeah.
It's a difficult time to try to do things where the whales don't want to wait for you.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you both. Much appreciated.
Yeah.
Thank you guys. Thanks for your seamless and excellent facilitations.
Yeah. Awesome.
That comes from you guys. answer a couple questions, so it's all good. Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, you guys. Bye.